1 year ago, I made the commitment to doing YouTube consistently, and now here we are, bad jokes and all. But even before I made the commitment, I had a few videos, my very first one of which was, Are Magical Musketeers Worth It? It's quite poetic that the new Link monster Magical Musketeer to the Max, or Magical Musketeer Max, is coming out this Friday. And while I originally wanted to do an Is It Worth It, I felt like I had to upload this video on the 10th, 2 days away from having more accurate prices. So instead, today, whether we snipe the holes in the archetype, what Magical Musketeer to the Max, okay, I'll stop doing that now, we'll find out what Magical Musketeer Max does for the archetype, and from there, we'll find out if Magical Musketeers are viable post Battles of Legend Heroes Revenge. Before we begin, if you guys want an amazing playmat that's super high quality, make sure you guys go check out Imperium Duelist. With a plethora of amazing designs, you won't regret making a purchase. If you want a discount on the product you purchase, make sure to use code BladeYGO10 at checkout for 10% off. With that, let's find out if Magical Musketeers are viable right now. Okay, so what are the basics of Magical Muskets? Well, the archetype revolves around activating spells and traps in the same column as your main deck monsters to gain some sort of effect. These effects include Caspar, which adds a card from the deck to your hand. This is the most important musket and gets you access to your disruption and follow-up monsters. We have Starfire, which special summons a magical musket from deck, which most importantly gets you access to Caspar or anything you do want in that scenario. It could be Doc if you already have Caspar, but the idea is Starfire is more consistency and helps you flood the field more. Doc adds a card from Grave, which is very important after turn 1 for recurring resources and keeping it up on the field with Caspar. We have Kid Brave, which discards 1 to draw 2. It helps you dig for more non-magical musket cards. To be honest, I think the big thing is that it gets monsters out of your hand if your hand is cloggy, but you usually want to keep the disruption in your hand. Like, I'm not gonna lie, the magical musket spells and traps are actually stuff you want. Like, they aren't bad whatsoever. They're like so good in this deck. Wild is a Daigusto Emerald, so not really the greatest in this type of deck, but Doc is just superior most of the time because it requires less resources in the grave, and you can keep recurring your good spells and traps that you want instead of drawing something that you may not want. Calamity is a monster reborn. Honestly, you don't really struggle with the amount of monsters you have. It's more you're worried about going through all of your spells and traps, because you'd rather recur spells and traps regardless, and Calamity does help you flood the field, but it doesn't help you initially flood the field, which is the main problem. And lastly, Yugioh draws cards during the opponent's end phase equal to the number of magical musket spells and traps activated while Yugioh was face up. So the first problem with this card is it's a level 8, which means you have to tribute summon it. Now you need to only tribute 1 magical musket for the tribute, but at the same time you don't really want to be tributing at all for Yugioh. But at the same time, this card is incredible with the new Link monster Max. So while the monsters provide the resource game, the spells and traps provide versatility to the archetype, including the following effects. Desperado destroys a card, Last Stand negates a spell and trap, Cross Domination negates a monster effect and reduces the target's attack and defense to 0, Dancing Needle banishes 3 monsters from the opponent's graveyard, Steady Hands doubles the attack and defense of a magical musket monster, Fiendish Deal protects magical muskets from card effects, and Crooked Crown locks main monster zones by special summoning a magical musket from hand. Honestly, these are some very powerful effects and can arguably be better than Striker cards, which is weird to think about. Striker mainly has Widow Anchor, while magical muskets have a Widow Anchor that can reduce attack and defense, can pop cards, negate spells and traps, a Shark Cannon that banishes 3, etc. I think Striker cards have a difference though, because Striker cards are meant to also take your opponent's resources to help you push for more cards, while the magical muskets mainly simplify simplify the game state. And remember, this doesn't mean Magical Muskets are the better deck. Striker inherently has a better resource game and don't have the same problems as Magical Muskets. But speaking of problems, what are the problems with Magical Muskets? Because they sound really appealing at first glance, but then there are some issues. First off, they are incredibly normal summon reliant. Your monster can easily be attacked over and then you can't activate your musket cards. And if your musket gets ghost ogred, for example, you lose, just as an example of how normal summon reliant this deck is. So many cards can deal with muskets because they are so reliant on your normal summon. Solemn Warning's another example of a card that can deal with Magical Muskets. Just anything to stop the normal summon can really hurt Magical Muskets, even though they can chain cards like Last Stand from hand as soon as the monster enters the field. And while muskets could simplify the game state incredibly well, before Max was revealed, it didn't have the ability to gain massive resources at once. Striker need 1 engage with 3 spells engraved and gain massive advantage. Striker need multi-roll and have activated all of their other striker spells in order to gain massive advantage. Muskets don't do this nearly as well. Yugioh is a way of gaining massive resources at once, but the issue is, how do you get it on the field turn 1 consistently enough? Well, you don't, and so Magical Muskets don't really have that big massive resource push like other decks have. But this is where the Link monster plays a huge role, which, speaking of which, how does Max impact the archetype and solve some of these problems? Well, Max is a Link 1 Light Fiend effect monster with 1000 attack and arrow pointing down, requires 1 level 8 or lower Magical Musket monster, and has the following effect. If this card is Link summoned, you can activate one of these effects. Add Magical Musket spells and traps with different names from your deck to your hand up to the number of monsters your opponent controls, or special summon Magical Musket monsters with different names from your deck up to the number of spells and traps your opponent controls. You can only use this effect of Magical Musketeer Max once per turn. During either player's turn, you can activate Magical Musket spells and traps from your hand. So this card solves the second problem immediately. This card gives you massive resources by plussing off something like Caspar and then more pluses off of Max. So think about it. Let's just say you have Caspar Upstart and you're going second. You normal summon Caspar, activate Upstart, and then you draw a card, get your search for anything with Caspar, and then you can link the Caspar into a Max, and then Max is going to either add more spells and traps. So if your opponent just controls 1 monster, you can add even more spells and traps in order to have more disruption. So basically, off that 1 play, you drew a card, you had 2 spells and traps in your hand, and you have a Max on field. Or you could have decided to flood the field more by putting more monsters on field, which isn't a bad idea either. Or if you need a way to get to Caspar, Max gets you access to literally any Magical Musketeer from your deck. So Magical Musketeer Max means any Magical Musket going second is a Caspar, which is honestly incredible and does help the consistency immensely. It doesn't typically matter which effect you get. I mean, obviously, depending on the scenario, you're gonna want one or the other, but either way, you're gaining a lot of resources, which is the main idea with this card. Like I stated, the second problem is that this deck needed a way to gain a lot of resources immediately rather than just simplifying the game state, and so this card helps you provide that. There are some issues with this card. This card doesn't solve the first problem with muskets, which is you have to normal summon a musket, then link summon Max, and that doesn't really help you solve the normal summon problem. So something that muskets still need is another way to normal summon, or just get more monsters on the field. So yeah, Magical Muskets really need a special summon card in order to work well. And you could make the argument that Crooked Crown helps a lot with this, and I don't disagree at all. This card is really good for the archetype in order to help special summon more monsters and get more monsters on the field. But the issue is you don't really want to play 3 of this card, because once you get the first one, it's not really as viable, and so it just becomes worse as the game goes on. But it helps initially get more monsters on the field, and it does have some sort of proactive effect to disrupt the opponent. So I think Crooked Crown is great for the archetype for helping the first issue, but it doesn't necessarily solve the issue, and I think that's one big thing we needed to address, but it doesn't necessarily solve the issue by itself. So I think another big thing with Max is it gets you whatever you need. Yugioh becomes way more more viable because you can get it out way more consistently. Any monster is cast bar, can get you more spells and traps if you need them, so really there's a lot of versatility with this card. But that versatility comes with a price, and that price is it's very dependent on the opponent what you can search, which leads me to the biggest issue of it being very reliant on the opponent. First off, you can't use this going first, which obviously hurts because you want to use this going first. You want to gain those massive resources as soon as possible. But if you let your opponent go first, then they're going to gain a lot of resources, and it's just going to be harder for you to play. You have to wait for your opponent to commit cards to the field in order to gain advantage off this card, and it may warrant the deck to blind second. You don't necessarily want to blind second though. Let's take a deck like Danger Thunder. Well, you could have hand traps that just may not be enough to stop Danger Thunder. So another thing is typically in Yu-Gi-Oh, you don't want to rely on your opponent doing a specific thing in order for you to do something. Let's say if you want your opponent to set cards but they play Sekka's Light, you don't get an opportunity to capitalize on your opponent setting something. You also don't get to choose what deck you're playing against, meaning you won't always get to gain the cards you want specifically. If your opponent is playing, for example, Danger Thunder, you won't be able to summon monsters from the deck, and you will only be able to search spells and traps, which may not be the best in that scenario if they have something like Colossus on the field, just as an example. So are Magical Musketeers viable now? I'm gonna say no, but Max is definitely a huge card and may warrant the deck to go second. I could 100% be wrong, but this is my current stance that there's a lot of room for them to be a rogue deck in general, and I think that's where they're gonna find their home at. But with that, guys, that was how viable Magical Musketeers are post Battles of Legend Heroes Revenge. Friday, July 12th, 2019 at 6:30 AM PST, we're going to try a Duel Links discussion on for size. Considering what the format is like right now in Duel Links, including the skills Light and Dark and Mask Tribute, we'll be taking a look at why Loomis and Umbra is the best character in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links right now. Thank you guys so much for watching, and with that, I'll see you soon.